We'll be talking about Shifu this morning, which is a fun topic to cover. It's woven paper, woven fiber in Japan. We'll be touching on things that cover both the weaving and a few other aspects of the use of the paper fiber as well. So let's go ahead and get started with this. This is a fabric that came into my hands, and the label on it says Taifuku no Kami, which means paper from a Taifuku journal. A Taifuku is what you see in this man's hand. It's a ledger that merchants kept to record all sales, any sorts of transactions, inventory notes, phone numbers, that type of thing. And as you can imagine, after a while, those really accumulated to quite a great degree. So they found a use for them, recycling, weaving them into textiles. This is a daifuku from my collection. You can see the red notations, the black notations. On occasion, they will have other colors in them as well. This is his daifukucho. You can see it's made up of several segments, all bound together. These were typically hung by a piece of rope here on a hook near the front door, near the desk. Sometimes it would be worn from the obi to keep it at hand for taking notation. He's taken it apart to use the individual sheets. He's going to be cutting the sheets, as you'll see in just a second, but I wanted to show you the diagram in the still photo just there. He's taken the pages out of the book, opened them up, and cut them so that they string out in this fashion. Now, he's gone to the ocean and collected a stone, but many things will work. He's spraying it with water to create increased traction as he rolls each little strand into a thread. Now, actually, to be honest, he's put too much water there. If you put that much water, the paper becomes very weak and will fall apart while you're rolling it. All you really need to do is dampen the paper itself slightly. And use the palm of your hand, use your fingers to roll it. And basically, you keep at this foot after foot, mile after mile, until you get enough to weave your project. The friction of the stone helps with the rubbing also to spiral it into a thread. I'll show you in a moment that other things work just as well. Cinder blocks work well. Sidewalks work well. I have a flagstone that I like to use that works quite well for me. Once he has his allotted amount, or until he gets tired, he goes ahead and puts it together, ready to set aside and dry for later use. And that's what he's doing here. He's just set it out on a stone to dry. That's all the Japanese says. It's kanso shimashita. It's aside to dry. Now, what he did find, he actually went to the more traditional method at this point by gathering the whole thing into a bundle, spraying it lightly with water rather than wetting the stone itself, and then taking the entire bundle and rolling it all at one time. You can imagine how much less time that takes. It doesn't really, at this stage, give as nice a twist. Once all of them are generally twisted like this, traditionally, if doing it entirely by hand, you would go ahead and open it up again and then go back to what he was doing earlier and twist everything as one strand going all the way along. It's much quicker, though, if you give it a head start. You'll notice that those little nodes, the joints where the paper makes its turn, the little extra tab where each section continues on, that doesn't get rolled at this stage. And so by opening up the thread and going back and continuing as he did earlier without spraying the stone, you wind up with very nice thread. You can see this isn't twisted quite as much as the earlier one. And in fairness to him, he'd really be putting more like about a half hour into this rolling part to get to this stage. You'll notice the black dots. Those black dots are the bits of ink that were in the paper earlier. He's adapted, slightly modern version, by taking this thread now that has been roughly twisted and going ahead and preparing the thread in this manner. You can see how much more efficient that would be. And in this one too, you can see the purples and the red ink that were in the original paper sheets. So by twisting the thread this way, he gets a much stronger yarn, a much tighter twist, and in the end, of course, a much finer weave. He has a bobbin now ready to go, and we'll move on to his weaving process. Now, I will mention one of the things he mentions in the larger videotape, which I said I encourage you to watch it. He does mention that he went ahead and steamed it after spinning the thread, as you just saw. So now that he's done, he's going to start in on his weaving. He's using an interesting tabletop loom. This is a hobbyist type, although it does a very nice job for this. It's a product that Clover makes. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Clover products. You can see what a very basic loom it is. However, nicely designed. It's, I think it's a brilliant design for what it is. He's able to space his thread nicely. Being a hobbyist loom, the dents are pretty far apart. But again, for the paper weaving, that's just fine. Okay, here again, you see the blue spots, the black spots, on occasion a red spot, which is inherent to this type of recycled weaving. It's part of the beauty, actually. Okay. Right, so once you've gone along this way and woven as much yardage as you have thread or your patience allows, you take it off the loom and you wind up with this sort of look. Very beautiful, very open. One of the distinguishing qualities of Shifu, the paper woven fabric, is how incredibly light it is. It weighs almost nothing. This very high quality paper. You will often use a different type of warp. The warp is most commonly cotton for everyday fabrics that the recycled textiles were intended to be. But also nowadays, it's not the least bit uncommon to find it as silk or even as synthetic in some cases. Now, this is a different weaver. She's using not recycled paper, but purchased paper, handmade paper, the same quality. It's just the same type of paper before it was ever bound into a book and written upon. You saw a moment ago how she pulled out her shredded strands, cut them apart into one long length. And now she's using cinder block bricks, She's using cinder block to get very much the same effect that he did with his rolling. It's not quite as decorative, but you can see how the cinder block would be much more efficient and easier to use than the stone, actually. Okay, so she's opening up the threads now. She can go ahead and continue to work at them. You have to open them up periodically to make sure that each strand is being twisted as an individual strand. And here to notice that in the end, the very last portion, the segment, the border that was left uncut that you see at the top and the bottom here, that hasn't been twisted. So she's going to go along and pinch, separate the top, then separate the bottom, separate the top, separate the bottom, zigzag, zigzag until she gets one long strand. And then she's going in and going to spin it further using her spinner as well. Spinning wheel like this certainly speeds things up. She is being careful not to allow the thread to become tangled as she goes. And so you'll want to be careful of that too. What I've brought out now to show you are a number of Shifu pieces, some that I've prepared, some are from Dorothy Miller's collection. This is a sheet of the paper. At one point, I did present some of this paper to an American Shifu weaver, and she wasn't really very happy, stating that it was not the right kind, that it was not the kind her teacher taught her to use, which I'm sure was quite correct. The thing is, you have to realize that traditionally they used recycled papers. So they used all sorts of papers. It wasn't quite as precious, perhaps, as what's being produced nowadays, but it was quite functional, quite beautiful, and interesting in its variety. So yes, you can use any kind of hand paper as long as you're able to go ahead and twist it, as I've shown you here. Again, here you have that top section, the border on each side, that's holding all the strands together as you get started. There again, picked apart top and bottom to create one long strand. And you can see how the top border is being gathered. I'm gathering it this way so that once it's moistened, I can go ahead and roll it. It keeps all the threads lined up. That's what you saw in the previous two weavers' demonstrations. They're gathering that top and gathering the bottom. This is a somewhat thick thread, relatively speaking. There's a thinner version of it that was cut in thinner strips that I'm showing you now. And the width is narrower. The width is determined by the size paper you have, of course. And now here is a set of threads that have been spun. You can see how very fine it is. Okay, and these are ready to be placed onto a bobbin, to be wound onto a bobbin. And then, of course, we have a completed hank here. And lastly, there are just a couple of other odds and ends. It doesn't have to be the recycled paper, the paper from a daifukucho. It can be any handmade paper. It could be a songbook. It could be anything that's quality. The handmade papers are long fiber, which is what gives them strength. Short fiber ones like newsprint, things of that nature really aren't worth your bother at all. Some of what you're seeing here is the netting, this macrame like on the end, as well as the additional dyed pieces. Here we see the Shifu threads, the spin threads being knotted into these knots. This can be as a hanging, as an example. Also, it was used as bags in some cases. It was used as additional clothing, as you saw for the warrior's outfit, which is what this is. Okay, this is the back view of it, and in just a moment here, we'll see the front view. And this is a kataginu, old Edo period style garment. Then they were often dyed with other things, such as indigo, or in this case, kakishibu, the persimmon tannin. And of course, that gives it strength. In many cases, the persimmon tannin will more or less waterproof the fiber itself, making it stronger, giving it this beautiful color range. This gives you a sample of the kakishibu. Paper was dyed beforehand, and there's some others. One of the higher quality types is called moro shifu. Moro means both in this case. So it's both warp and weft shifu. Again, that's the highest quality. Here's another example. This one says kodai moro shifu, so ancient age or antique style. That what it's referring to when it says antique style is the fact that this one, let me go back just a tiny bit more. This particular one is perhaps recycled paper, but not a daifukucho. If it were daifukucho, it would have had the notations in it, which would give us the spots. And so when this particular one refers to it as kodai shifu, meaning ancient age or antique, it's the type that has the spots in it, which means that it actually is from the daifukucho, like the one we saw at the very beginning of the talk. Okay, so here's another example of some of the paper that's used. You can see the long fibers at the edge from the hand screening. And again, some of the beautiful threads, brilliant white. These are with new paper, of course, paper manufactured specifically for this purpose, and yarns twisted specifically for this purpose. And here's a sample of some of the yardage. Some yardage is coarser. The ones in your sample this time for the group are a little on the coarser side with cotton warp. There are more industrial versions of this, and that's what we see going on here. So even though it's the long fiber paper, it's not hand screened, but it's still very high quality. That in turn, as the notation said a moment ago, the paper is shredded into one moment, so very, very thin strands, spun by machine, set up on looms, and produced commercially. My understanding is there are only 2 or 3 of these types of mills left in Japan at this point. Okay, and here you see the elaborate setup for this with the huge bobbins of paper thread that have already been spun. And they can be dyed beforehand or afterward, setting up a huge warp for production work. And here we see the mechanized loom having at it. This type of woven textile is not used for clothing, not when it's done in this type of industrial form. Usually this type is used for wallpapers and that type of covering that you'll see in a moment. The technique is the same though. Here you see what a huge setup of the massive number of warp threads going into this as they set up an industrial loom. These are older samples. These were done as wallpaper. These particular samples are from about 60 years ago. Now, the coloring in them, not being recycled paper, the colors put into them are done with pigments, the ganryo. Those of you taking the katazome or bingata classes know what that is. It's the same pigment we would use in our fabric dyeing. And the main reason for that is the pigment doesn't fade with time. So here are a couple of examples of interiors done with these beautifully woven Shifu wallpapers, or screens in this case. You can see it's very transparent as a divider. I want to be sure and point out to you, any of you interested in Shifu, be sure and check out this book. The author has done a wonderful job, very, very thorough, full of cultural side notes and things that I think you'll really enjoy. Very well photographed. It's really a treasure in my library. And one of the things that really attracted to me, and certainly cinched the sale, is the fact that on the very back pages, there are samples of a very nice quality woven Shifu square, as well as you can see how very thin the sample of paper, that weight of paper was used in the hand weaving of the samples included. So again, quite a treasure for anyone's library. I highly recommend it. Susan Bird did a wonderful job with the book, so please do check it out. Going back to that Daifukucho for just a moment, the one from my collection, let's take another quick look at that. And if you skim through the pages, you'll see there are blank areas, there are heavily written areas, there are areas with the different shades of red scribbled in, stamps and all of that. So whatever happens to be on the page is in the end what colors your thread. Let's go ahead and look a bit more closely at this now. Here is a piece from my collection that is one woven from the Daifukucho. I like this particular one because, as with many items in my collection, it has a complete detail, the provenance of the piece, describing what goes into it, who the weaver is, and that type of thing. And I always like it when they include a sample of the dye, a sample of the yarn. In this case, the Shifu strand is there. This was intended to be sewn into an obi. It never was. It's left in its off-the-loom state, and that's how it was sold. And you can see the wonderful overall splash marks of the characters of the ink, the sumi ink, that got caught up in the production of the thread. The warp in this case is silk. There are often a little bit thicker, a little bit thinner areas to the thread, a little bit like a slub. And that's because where the thread makes that turn Okay, the 180 turn, and you wind up with that little border tab. That gives you a little bit, makes the yarn a little bit thicker right at that point. It's a type of mizuori, basically, or undulating line. And you can see the undulating weft are the Shifu threads. Okay, and yet another one. It's always nice to have the information with it. This one tells you the background of the piece. It tells you what's in it. It was designed for a fukuro obi, as an example. But these particular strands have not been twisted the way we've seen used to date, to this point. These are kept a bit more flat, and they're allowed to scrunch in and remain splayed throughout the entire weave. So they're flat bands, basically, rather than spun round bands, round threads. This is the same thing, perhaps a little bit easier to see. The bands are wider. The Shifu portion of this that's obvious are the wide bands, but even the narrow, solid color bands in between are woven paper as well. And this was fabric for a Nagoya obi. Another undulating line one. This was done with a wave-shaped beater bar to create the imagery. All of the blue sections and the wave lines are the paper portion, and the rest is the silk warp. This one is very similar to the bands that we saw a moment ago, gold-leafed, silver-leafed, painted with pigments, sliced apart, kept in order, rewoven to reproduce the patterning that you saw. The back is silk. The back is not Shifu. Now, this is one that's often underrated. Certainly 50 years ago, you used to see these a lot at the flea market and very little value assigned to them. But they're also Shifu. Here, let's take a look at this. See what I'm pulling out, the springy section? That's rayon. It's rayon that the Shifu strand has been wrapped with. Wrapping it with the rayon gives the Shifu, the thread, a little bit more strength. You still have the incredible light weight and suppleness of the paper, but you have the extra strength that the rayon thread lends to it. And these were everyday workers' obi. Okay, to me, it's quite special, even though they're very inexpensive, were very common. Still, it's quite a treasure in that you can see all of this, all of these strands are paper strands wrapped with the rayon and then treated as any other yarn would be. This is one that was sold to me by a very reputable merchant. I certainly trusted them completely. But when I received it, as beautiful as it is, I was kind of disappointed because it was sold to me as Shifu. Looked very beautiful, very nice quality. But, you know, it just felt too much like silk. So for this video, just to be on the safe side, I thought, well, let's test it and I'll prove my point, okay? So what I did is I opened up the back of the obi, where it's not going to show, won't be harming the obi at all, clipped it just a little bit. My goal is to go ahead and separate out some of the weft to go ahead and verify what I believe is that it's silk. Go ahead and piece that apart. And now the test is to pull it. Okay, paper will be weaker than silk, of course. And so if I go ahead and just pull it, put quite a great deal of effort into it, you can see it's not breaking. As much as I like the obi, I'm still satisfied, you know, that it's not paper. But you know what? That was my decision. Then as I started to edit and pull this clip together, I could see it magnified on my screen. And I realized, wait, that paper core looks just like the rayon a minute ago. So it looked very much like it's been wrapped. It's just been wrapped with silk, which is why the textile itself feels so much more like silk. And sure enough, look at that. If I get in with a close-up of what I had teased apart earlier, I see that not only is there the paper-like splaying, which silk wouldn't do, but I can also see that the yarn itself has been wrapped with silk. The fact that it's been wrapped with silk is what's keeping it from breaking as I pull on it. That's not working. What will certainly weaken the paper is if I go back in and wet it. Wetting will also weaken the paper in a way that it won't weaken silk. So, okay, go back in, put another clip. The bluish portion is the silk wrapping. Tease that away, get in there with a wet finger and moisten that yarn. See what happens. Well, it's still not pulling apart, but of course it hasn't had a chance to get damp yet. If I stick to it, then what happens is it does pull apart, and the thread breaks in a way that paper breaks, not in a way that the silk would snap. And so it is indeed a very beautiful Shifu piece. I was satisfied before, but I'm even more satisfied now. So the moral of this story is don't believe everything you think. I thought I was verifying it, but I was kind of convinced in my answer before I ever went to it. And being convinced in what I thought the result would be, of course, I proved myself right, even if I was wrong. It was the screen that allowed me to see in the magnification my mistake. So please be careful. There's nothing like having a little bit of self-assuredness to lead you down the wrong path. So I'm going into a couple of other types now. These are technically not Shifu, but it is dealing with paper, so I want to touch on them. This is woven silk lino. We covered linos in an earlier session. And in this case, it has the same handmade Japanese paper that has been dyed, tinted, wet around the edges so that you could tear the paper and get fuzzy edges, and then laminated to the silk. So it's a little bit along the line of an applique with the meaning of it's applied to. The handmade paper, the washi, has been dyed, picked apart, reassembled, a little bit quilt-like, a little bit applique-like, without stitching, and then attached to the silk as a summer obi with this cabbage pattern. This is another version of that. These are flowers out of the handmade paper on a beautiful platinum and silk background. And you can see how beautifully and delicately each little bit of paper has been tinted before applying it to the silk. It's not unusual to have things, doodahs, glued onto Japanese obis. In this case, you see it's paper and quite beautiful. This is another version with dyeing, painting with pigments in the background in addition to the applique of the paper. This is also done with bagworm skins and all sorts of other things. In our next cycle going into the following year, we'll be covering bagworms and some of these other paper techniques. So here again, you see very beautiful, very simple pieces. This is on a very rustic background with the camellias out of very delicate shades. These applique artists, applying artists, are certainly artists in their own right. That pretty much covers what I presented for you today. I'll go ahead and sign off. Thank you all for being here, and we'll join in with the rest of the club members. Thank you then. Bye-bye.